Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming this morning. Several weeks ago, the TESOL 2016 Program Convention Chair, who is sitting right down here in the front row, Leslie, thank you for all of your work bringing this week together. Leslie asked me about introducing Eric Dwyer, and of course I agreed even before she finished asking the question. But I opted to agree not just for myself, but I also thought immediately of Beth Witt. Together, Beth, Eric, and I consider ourselves the three musketeers of TESOL conventions. We were the convention chairs for Beth in 2002, myself in 2003, and Eric in 2004.
Now, we will invite you to Google Eric Dwyer at FIU, which stands for Florida International University, and you will see a list of professional service, publications, presentations, positions held, languages spoken. We counted 4 with a good degree of fluency and another 5 that he has studied, his academic pedigree, and so on. But Mark and I know another side of Eric, and that's what we want to share with you. We know a very musical Eric, who can sing, write music, and is an accomplished pianist. He has even sung songs from the musical Godspell with Mark in the middle of a street in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He's a life partner with Ben and a fabulous stepdad to 2 wonderful kids. He grew up a Westerner in the United States in Logan, Utah, way north where there are large mountains and much snow. And it's easier to list the states of the U.S. and the countries in the world that he has not visited than to list the ones that he has visited. Okay.
Eric is a good friend and colleague to hundreds of people around the world, and probably more. I dare say probably into the thousands. He is a highly principled man of deeply held convictions, and he has a strong social conscience. He is a person who teaches others to see how they can empower themselves to write their own culturally appropriate materials, to do research that informs teaching in their own context, and to advocate for themselves and for their students. Beth and I are proud to call him, you, Eric, our friend and mentor, and we are honored on behalf of all of you and all of TESOL to welcome to this podium Dr. Eric Dwyer.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you. I will do my best to defy the descriptions that have just been unleashed. I want to ask a question. What happens when it's bad outside? I don't mean a storm. I don't mean a hurricane or an accident or a tornado, volcanic eruption. I mean really bad. The badness caused by humans, sometimes even our friends, our colleagues, our officials, our compatriots. What happens when it's so bad we choose between being inside and being outside simply because it's just simply less bad in than it is out? But even within our homes, the bad can come inside without warning, without permission, with brutality in mind, with an urge of power and a power that overtakes children, teachers, and anything having to do with optimism. Well, this conversation is a long one. It's been going even before Michael West started the idea of teaching English in difficult circumstances a half century ago. And I'd like to build on some of the academic works that we've seen regarding teaching in difficult circumstances with some sort of personal stories and also acting upon the work of many friends, some of whom are here today. One of my best friends who wants to operate with this is the key author on this. His name is Amini Ngabonziza, John de Dieu, and he was invited for this presentation, but I'm afraid he couldn't get a visa. So I'm very sorry that he's not here. But this is Amin, and he's an English instructor at the Agriculture, Technology, and Education of Chibungo. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And we have a running thesis to this presentation, which I hope is evident. However, we'll just have to do the best. But he did send a couple of videos. So let me start off with one video that he sends from, it's about 5 minutes. Okay?
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Amini Ngabonziza Jandechi. I'm a PhD student at the...
So the video's not going. I'm going to play his sound piece. He did this from his room at his home. Here we go.
University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Chibungo, unique in Rwanda. I'm going to share with you my experience of learning a language in a difficult time and place. If I look back to my linguistic background, it seems as though I've been preparing through my entire life to research issues regarding language education in difficult places. I was born into a difficult and multilingual environment in the then Zaire. Currently it is called Democratic Republic of Congo, which is DRC. There, my home language, Kinyarwanda, differed from the medium of instruction, Swahili and later French. My parents spoke Kinyarwanda as their primary language because they originated from Rwanda. I could easily listen to them speaking Kinyarwanda, but I used to respond to them in Swahili and some French. Swahili is a language which was used in Zaire. It is also currently used. And my grandparents had been forced to move to Zaire in 1959. During 1959, the new political movement in Rwanda, eager to fight for power, had begun terrorizing and killing all the Tutsi aristocracy, and this forced many Tutsi to flee the country to neighboring countries. After independence in 1962, many Rwandans in refugees camps lost the hope to return home because the government in power were developing actually policies against the Tutsi and practically preparing genocide against Tutsi. I was born during the assimilation period and I was given a Swahili name, Amin, to hide to some extent my Rwandan identity so that I could be accepted easily into the education system in Zaire. In the later 1994, after the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, the new Rwandan government encouraged all refugees to return home, which was the dream of many Rwandan refugees. My family and I returned home when I was about to complete grade 2. The new school environment was different from the one that I was used to, in particular with regard to the language of teaching and learning. At the time, I was a fluent speaker of Swahili and could follow lessons in French. However, my new medium of instruction was Kinyarwanda, and Kinyarwanda was assumed to be my mother tongue, but my comprehension of the language was very limited. Having to learn a foreign language that was assumed to be my mother tongue made me having to repeat not only grade 2. I was actually advised to start schooling from grade 1 in order to learn to speak and write Kinyarwanda, which is the medium of instruction from grade 1 to grade 3 in Rwandan primary school. I quickly acquired speaking skills in my assumed first language, but writing proved me to be difficult, and I repeated a year learning the basics. Therefore, considering my own struggle related to a foreign language of teaching and learning, I am motivated to research issues regarding language education in difficult places. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, so you can see that Amin doesn't necessarily have a genocide story from 1994. Well, he kind of does, but he kind of doesn't. He returned to Rwanda after the genocide because it's actually easier for him to be there. But his story is still a story of displacement, escaping violence at the time of independence. And you hear the consequences of that displacement within his family. And you also hear how language issues arise easily as a result of displacement and even return. In a way, too, Amin's return to Rwanda was displacement. The genocide of 1994 wasn't the end of violence. It merely shifted to the west 100 kilometers into the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, which ultimately became 2 Congo wars that unleashed the death of over 4 million people. In effect, Amin's family fled twice. Well, we'll return to Amin's story in a little bit, but I want to also talk about our field and who participates in professional development with our colleagues like Amin. And I would never meet the Amins of the world without the help of the United States State Department and the regional language officers. These are pretty amazing people that give great deals of sacrifice and time and movement in order to try and figure these things out. The relos are in country for 3 years and are often part of the landscape in so-called hot zones. And they invite people like these that you see up here, colleagues who have all traveled to such places. And 2 of them are actually my own FIU students. And together, these colleagues, or perhaps, if you will, academic tourists, have gone to interesting parts of the world for at least a little while. A couple of weeks, a month, maybe a year, maybe longer. But for the most part, if we need be, we can always leave. But it's still sort of interesting how this sort of interplay works. I mean, I look at Mark, who talked a little bit ago, and others, and the relos have said to me, you know, in this job, you have colleagues who will value your work and your ideas, and they will drive through bullets to see you. At some point, it will be your turn. And so I felt a sense of obligation to try and make that happen, that I should participate. And indeed, for some people, a number of relos and colleagues have even touted their experience getting from the Baghdad airport into the green zone of Baghdad, wearing armor and feeling their pulse quicken as they go through the bad part of town. And one relo said to me, it was one of the most exciting times of my life. And there is a sense of tourism in all of that. And here's Mary Lou, who went to Afghanistan with me, and we're looking out our window of our our van with the 2 layers of bulletproof glass. And, you know, there's a sense of tourism and excitement about it. And then all of a sudden we get off the plane in Kabul, and the guards introduce themselves, the bulletproof vests, the hard hats, the radio in case anything happened to them, and the machine guns in case anything happened to them, saying, here, if anything happens to us, here are the machine guns. Have a good time. And we enjoyed Kabul from the 2 layers of our windows. At least they told us there were 2 layers there. And Mary Lou had been to quite a number of war zones, and I'd been to a couple, and some were not war zones yet when I went. When I went to Syria in 2006, it wasn't a problematic area so much. It was kind of rumbling, you know. And so we've gotten to get some nice stamps in our visas, and some interesting ones, especially the ones marked in red. But I want to talk academically on top of this 2-tiered context. One, Amin's story of displacement and how he becomes a teacher, and then our role, and my friend's role, maybe some of us, and what happens when we go to places like this. And one thing that I'd like to make an argument about is a concept that I'm calling anti-contextualization, particularly in the idea that we've placed such a great deal of emphasis on the idea of context as being important to completing what we need to do if we're going to do it well. In fact, it's almost a given that context is perceived as critical to our sense of good teaching. And in my experience in research, I have sought means for local folks to create or establish their own sense of context. However, my research has also indicated that there are numerous outside resources of anti-context, often elements of power that preclude our ability to establish foundational context upon which we can build education. And I have found that these forces often do so seemingly on purpose. So I'll have a look at these ideas and give an idea. The second concept, apart on top of anti-contextualization, I'd like to spend a moment on, is the idea of crescendo. And the crescendo is built simply on Krashen's I+1 and how we do this. And sure enough, you've got background knowledge and you sort of add 1 to it. And if it all works out well, if you've got the background knowledge, i.e., let's say, for example, cultural capital, social capital, fluency with the power language, including vocabulary, time, school resources, and a good class size, then you can probably add 1 very comfortably, and you have a good shot at making certain that learning happens. How's that for a theory? All right? All right. So then, if we have all those things, we can have 1. Right? But sometimes we get things and you don't get it all. You may not have social capital. You might not have the school resources. Right? You may have something else. You may not get all that you want, or you might get too much of a good thing, like class size. You know, right? And even that could preclude what we really want to do. In the meantime, we know that when we have one of those elements missing, I+1 is now I is greater than 1, which depresses the idea of good teaching, right? And we all may know what that means when we're trying to do it. So what are the items, I posit, that preclude crescendo? What inhibits it? And I'll say that there's some of these things. One is transmission models, lecturing. Second is post-colonial practices, poverty, and I mean both teachers and students, and sometimes the teachers are hungrier than the students. Non-localized materials, in other words, things written by us here. Large multi-level proficiency classes, where you've got every proficiency level all in the same class, and threats of violence. So let's see what happens. I'm going to give you just a few examples. The first one is Angola, where I went in 2007. So it's been a little while, but it's interesting to see where what has happened. Because when I went, they were just 2 years outside of war, and they have quite an interesting history. At the time, a life expectancy of about 55 years, some languages, but mostly Portuguese, and they gained independence in 1975. There was a political power that led by Agostinho Neto, and he led power, and he was president for a long time. Well, actually, José Eduardo dos Santos was the guy that stayed in power for a long time. Neto died in 1979. But José Eduardo dos Santos was still in power even when I was there. But they had a war for 27 years. And the Angolan government had the daunting challenge of rebuilding the country's physical and social infrastructure. Well, when you get there, the evidence is quite clear. They're bombed out buildings with big holes, and people actually live above where the bombing out was. And you see kids get to play on ledges that don't have any barrier walls to make sure that they don't fall off. But I think that it's evident when you see the bullet holes, especially those in schools. It gets a little bit depressing. But it's still important for us to see what happens when we have post-conflict scars. At the same time, when we were there, it was interesting how Angola was touted as being a completely economic success, namely in the name of oil, and yet there were so few resources for teachers. I've never seen such... I think there are examples even stronger than those of Angola, but in my experience, I'd never been to a place with such a disparity between poor and rich. And I was poor. So it was very, very difficult. On the other hand, the reason that we go is because of beautiful, passionate teachers. And my goodness, what a treat to be in our profession and see who's around with us. And Angola was, as every country that I've ever been to, has been a case of that. And they were just totally willing to do anything. But of course, teachers need stuff. And so this colleague said, what text have you brought me from the United States that I may teach my students better? And I'm thinking to myself, how am I going to schlep 50 to 100 textbooks? And on the other hand, the textbooks are probably written here. And so how are they going to resonate with the people that are asking for them in the first place? Here's the second one. This guy named José, I remember his name. He tells a common story. And he said one day he wanted a text, and he was going to get it himself, and he found a colleague who had a credit card. So he got on the computer, went to Amazon.com, he used the credit card, he paid for it, he paid for the shipping, and it got to Luanda, and he got a note saying that it arrived at the port, and when he got to the port, he was told that he had to pay import fees, and then he had to pay storage fees, and the storage fee increased daily. So each day that he didn't pay for the storage fee, the more expensive it got. And ultimately, he discovered that he got the book, but it was inaccessible because it was on the other side of a metal door, and he never did find a way to open the metal door. He was literally 5 inches from the book that he wanted, and he never got to touch it, and he lost the money. Well, if we look in terms of what anti-contextualization might mean for a case like Angola, we see that we have events with no props or visuals. There's no blackboards or something like that. Again, huge classes, 50 to 200 students. And we even worry about the maintenance of language in terms of who our sponsors are. In our case of our own conference, it was by clearly colonialist powers like Halliburton or Chevron. They were sort of have interesting bed partners, and depending on what your politics are. So it's very, it poses some very interesting personal challenges that, well, okay, well, what am I doing? I'm here. Do I help? Where are my morals? It throws them all out of whack, right? The same is true for the year I had in Rwanda in 2010 when I was on a Fulbright scholarship. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. And this is how I met Amini. So here's Rwanda, right? Itty-bitty country in the middle of Africa. It's about the size of Vermont. 11 million people, though. One of the most crowded countries in Africa. It's the most crowded country on mainland Africa. And has only one regional language. The Germans arrived there back at the end of the 19th century, and the Rwandan Mwami, this is sort of the king of Rwanda, declared himself a Tutsi, and the Germans lost the region to Belgium during World War I, but the Belgians perpetuated the distinctions, including the idea that the Tutsis were superior. If you're familiar with Rwandan history, then you know about the two main organizations, communities, the Tutsis and the Hutus. Well, this is where Amin came in. He said, Eric, you're wrong. We noticed here how important it can be to show the local person Amin. And he says to the visitor, me, Eric, you got this wrong. You're wrong. The Rwandan Mwami did not declare himself a Tutsi. In fact, he wrote, Mwami was superior to Tutsi and Hutu. Thus, he didn't belong to a social category, Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa, and he was crowned king. However, the king was chosen from the high social category, cattle-keeping Tutsi. Therefore, the statement that the Mwami declared himself Tutsi is funny to Rwandans, as it doesn't have sense. Uh-oh, I've been corrected. And then he said, and by the way, where did you find out your source? And I said, Paul Gurovich's book. And he said, well, that's a U.S. source. Bong. Right. So, in the conflict zone, fundamentally, outsiders attempt to figure out their new environs. I got to figure it out. I got to do the best I can, right? But outsiders also have to accept that their version of truth will be questioned at the most fundamental details by local. And it's quite likely that I'll get it outright wrong. So suddenly, our story is interrupted. Here we, who are the academic tourists, and if you're not an academic tourist, I'm not referring to you, we have to stop ourselves in mid-stride and shake our heads a bit. We must come to grips with the fact that our version of truth will probably be questioned at the most fundamental of details. In fact, as I look back at my blogs that I wrote during that year, I got a lot of stuff wrong. We as outsiders must come to grips with the notion that we are guessing a lot and that our stories and the local stories may not be copacetic, no matter how hard we try to make them so. So, back to the story of Rwandan history, we see that in the 1930s we had identity cards developed. And these are the identity cards that show that you were Hutu, Twa, or Tutsi. And these identity cards preceded the same ones that we saw in South Africa by 20 years. Well, those identity cards became important when genocide time came around. Belgium similarly had transgressions regarding its own community identity as well. Theirs was quite language-based. However, the French-speaking Walloons, albeit a minority, had power in Belgium and had been supporting the minority Tutsis. However, the Flemish speakers were actually the majority at that time, and those coming to Rwanda similarly backed the Hutus. Well, this act of identity and divide preceded 16 years the similar separation act that we saw in South Africa. So then independence came, and many people escaped, including Amin's family to Zaire, and then others to Burundi and various places. This guy became president in 1972, and this guy ended up invading Rwanda in the early 1990s. He had escaped just as Amin's family had, only he escaped to Uganda. And when he escaped to Uganda, he did not go to a French-speaking country. He went to an English-speaking country. Well, he and his compatriots decided to invade and come back to Rwanda, and they successfully took it over at the same time as the genocide. And by doing so, actually ended the genocide on the 4th of July in 1994. So his name is Paul Kagame. Now, the genocide was dreadful, and it started pretty much because of an airplane crash that involved the two leaders of two countries, Burundi and Rwanda. And each side blamed the other, and we still don't know who's responsible. But the genocide lasted for 100 days, and the number that's quoted all the time is 800,000 people died in a couple of months, mostly by machetes. Many of them killed inside schools and churches. There were even supporters from France known as Opération Turquoise that were accused of some atrocities. But by the 4th of July, Paul Kagame's troops had invaded Kigali and taken over the country. All right. So the refugees come back, and Amin comes back. And Kagame becomes president in 2003, and he's still president now. And by 2010, by the time I'd been there, they'd done a lot of work in with donors of other countries and become a very exciting place for Western countries to donate to. And they became known as the donor darling of Africa. And so then I show up and I learned that I get to teach this class that has 90 students and 75 chairs and a blackboard. And we sort of see what the context is we are now. It's a post-conflict context. And in line with the United Nations 2015 Millennium Goals, we have what we wanted. We have more students who can afford to attend school and university. We have large classes. The students are delighted to go, and they go. And classes are in the language of the nation's leadership, but we still have no resources. So 20 years prior to that, we had trouble getting kids in school, sometimes because they weren't schools. But now we don't have that problem as much, but we still don't have the resources. We don't have the resources for the students to use, and we don't have the money to pay teachers. So, what do? We worry about a number of things. Again, I worry about anti-contextualization, because policy seems to be making education purposely harder than it needs to be. All the time I thought, maybe this is just economics. But policies seemed often to get in the way. For example, we had the idea of doing a library development, and I had the money offered through the State Department, and I had permission to do the work through the National University of Rwanda, but we couldn't get it to go. And policies by both the offices in Kigali and in Washington, D.C., and the policies of our own university interfered. I can go at length about how those policies interfered, but we couldn't get it done, and I was asked to put together a library. I was there a year, and no library happened. In fact, it was taken away from the students altogether. In the meantime, on October the 18th, 2009, French was replaced by English as the colonial language because President Kagame doesn't speak French. And it happened overnight. All of a sudden, 30-year teachers who had been speaking French were asked and required to be teaching in English, even if they didn't have to. And they got a year to learn it. Right? Since then, just a couple of years, 4 years ago, the Parliament, who didn't tout Kinyarwanda or Swahili as principal education languages, finally installed Kinyarwanda as a primary language for grades 1 through 3. And that was a pretty good thing to do. All right. Now, what I think is very interesting about the language shift in 2009 is that it's akin to what happened in South Africa in 1975 through a proclamation called the Afrikaans Medium Decree. And nobody was ready when they had an overnight shift from any abundance of languages, mostly English, to Afrikaans. And so Afrikaans had to be taught in the schools almost immediately. And what was even worse, and the reason why we had the Soweto riots, is because the students were not passing the tests, which were all of a sudden, within 1 year's time, in Afrikaans. So, we've also seen the shift, overnight shifts in Namibia, and there was one even this year, I understand, in Malawi. So we have to be very aware of what happens when there's an overnight shift of language. It's not an easy thing, and you can preclude the education of a generation with that kind of a decision. In the meantime, I'm there in 2010. I didn't know any of this, right? I'm trying to get it right. And I'm guessing, right? So all of a sudden, a parliamentary report comes out in the summer. And the parliament has condemned my university where I'm studying, saying, you're not teaching the teachers how to be in English soon enough. Well, one reason I've been asked to go was because I could help the teachers get their English up to snuff. But while I was there, they said, teach a class, do teacher training. That'll be good enough. You can work at the library, right? All of a sudden, Parliament says, National University of Rwanda, you're in trouble. And the phone rang immediately. What workshop can you do for us? All of a sudden, I was important, right? And I got called into the vice provost's office at the university. And he said, didn't you say, though, Eric, that sheltered English is a bilingual approach? Because I was going to do a sheltered English thing, right? And I said, it is, but the technique I'm proposing is one that hopefully makes content in any language more accessible to those who don't speak it. In other words, in those bilingual classes, one usually commits only to one language. Then the teacher uses the linguistic gymnastics to make the content in the single language of its lecture accessible to more people than would normally get it. Good, because, Eric, we don't want the idea of bilingualism to be the motivator in this instance. I raised my eyebrows, and he said to me, noticing my awe, "You see, Eric," I was in trouble, "any indication at all that we're promoting bilingualism could be registered by Parliament as an overt subversion of their mandate." Subversion? Bilingualism is subversion. And I was thrown. I thought, what on earth could they be meaning? And the next day, I was taking a bath, and I was like, what is going on here? I don't get it. And all of a sudden, bing! I think this is a problem. We don't have identity cards anymore post-genocide. But we still have communities that have an advantage one over the other. Could it be, I'm only asking, could it be this is a form of shibboleth? In other words, we're going to separate by figuring out who speaks what, and we will be tolerant of those who speak English. So it's okay for you to be of the other community so long as you speak something closer to the community in charge. And it seemed to me that the students were okay with that they had figured that out. There are many Hutus who were studying English and happy to do so, right? So I posited the idea that this is shibboleth. And for those of you who are familiar with the story from the Bible, in other words, if an Ephraimite could palatalize the s sound, making a sh instead of the basic s, a sound akin to a child saying shoe instead of shoe, then the life of the sh pronouncing Ephraimite would be spared. Well, if we look at this, immediate switch to colonial English, leadership mostly English speaking, identity cards eliminated, designation between communities made illegal, English-speaking leadership imported from Uganda to Kenya, English translation one of the largest powers at the university, thus English equals power. English equals power. To be part of the global economy, we got the neoliberal narrative starting. One must learn English. And if you don't, you're going to be left out. In order to foster such, time on task is most crucial. Then one must do English, English, English. But bilingualism is subversive. How does that work? That means, wouldn't bilingualism make education easier? Our research shows that when you do it bilingually, it makes it easier. You have access to the information. It should be easier. Transfer is easier. But no, this is subversion. Is this a modern Sibboleth policy? Well, I asked this question, and I said, well, if I have to make sure that I know this, let me see if there's any evidence in the region of shibboleth acting as policy. And lo and behold, in the United Nations report on the Congolese War, there is a section on shibboleth being used in order to separate communities and figure out who to kill and who not to. And it happened at the ex-FAR Interahamwe by the AFLDR, APR forces across the entire Congolese territory. Checkpoints, a hallmark of the genocide in Rwanda, were established in Fizi and Uvira territories. According to the report, Section 199, RPF soldiers stopped people and identified them as refugees based on their accents, explained to them that they were to be repatriated back to Rwanda, separated them from the others, and then shot them. Well, as you can imagine, this report has been highly criticized by the Rwandan government. And so I said this to Amin, and guess what? He highly criticized it. He wrote, I may suggest to delete this as my previous comments. First, this is not evidence as the government of Rwanda rejected it. I would suggest that we delete this slide because it is not illustrating the English case as power and might cause problems to me as a Rwandan who have not to consider the fact against my country while it is not yet agreed by the two concerned parts. So, what am I going to do? My sense is I support the UN report as passing muster with respect to the report of qualitative data, reporting only phenomena that are triangulated. But Amin's sense is, he was saying to me in a sense, I'm afraid you're not correct. The UN and Rwandan government have never come to a consensus. There are sound reasons in Rwanda to reject this story. If you wish to discuss how English relates to asserting haves and have-nots, then I'm with you. However, the idea that English can play a role in future violence, much as a former identity card, is far-fetched. That's kind of hard to argue with. Maybe he's right. Am I making an intellectual leap? And am I going too far as an academic in making that conclusion? And that is a very appropriate question to ask me. And apart from having the UN report, I would have to triangulate the report with other data in order to figure out the degree to which I might be right or not. But that does not preclude me from the idea that I worry about shibboleth. But it also does not relieve me of my responsibility to care about Amin. So, what do? I want to foster a positive relationship. I would need to work with disagreement, and I have to edit and re-edit my opinions. I have to admit that I am behind, that I will always be behind, and that I will never catch up. And I have to pray to the English language teacher gods, please do not let me behave as overly confident foreigners as have behaved before me. Please, right? So here's my model of anti-contextualization as far as Rwanda is concerned. Bilingualism is considered subversive by Parliament. English speakers maintain power. We have got large classes, and the professors write on the board an hour before classes, and then they erase it. And there's a chance that there's shibboleth as a key ingredient of how we make it through and use English, which means if that's true, I play a role in it. I don't like that, right? But on the other hand, as far as the means concerned, maybe that bottom one is questionable. But I don't want to lose the question. But he doesn't like the question. And that's as far, and I have to leave it at that. That's the lake I have to swim in. So what is my role as a responsible English language teacher? Well, the compulsion for this question stems from the work of Daniel Ramirez-Lamus, a Colombian scholar who ponders whether programs are teaching English responsibly. And he asks us to reflect on any English language program that pertains to creating inequalities among citizenry, fostering English as a gatekeeping element that precludes non-English using citizens from advancing in their own societies. Indeed, if prospective teachers are aware of the socio-political ramifications of language across the world, and if they are knowledgeable enough of it to converse about it in their own classes, they should do so. He reminds us that we have roles in advancing multilingualism, thereby affecting a periphery of communities who may not have the resources available for keeping up with communities connected more and more with English or other lingua francas. Similarly, he reminds us that we have responsibilities with the children of these periphery communities to advance their communities in ways they've never experienced. Finally, he suggests that our responsibility is not to teach just subjects and verb phrases. We must also teach the culture of our students' heroes. Therefore, I have to do a self-reflective ick. And this is, in my mind, inescapable. If I'm to get things right, I cannot go into a country as an educator. I must be a questioner. The realization that I must escape my role as a colonialist, even if I advocate for a non-colonial approach. And to succeed, I think, I will posit, we need three contributors: heroes, fielders, and researchers. I can only be a researcher. I need Amin to be a fielder, and he can help me find heroes. So here's some heroes from Rwanda. Here's Philippe, the rabbit and rice farmer. I thought he would be an awesome guy to go meet so we could do some work out in his. It was very, very interesting how rabbits become a very integral part to rice farming. Who knew? Actually, the Peace Corps does, right? There's the Peace Basket woman. This woman is considered the champion peace basket maker. She is, we're talking about big C elements. I don't mean to be too superficial about this, but she is clearly a hero in the community. And then Jean Bosco, who also is an artist and is able to promote the very real and contributing art forms of the southern area of that region that make it around the world. These are real heroes. We can develop materials based on their lives and their contributions. For me to start a Rwandan textbook, I would start with them. So let's go back to Amin and his idea of Ubuntu, and I'll see if I can get this to play.
Frankly speaking, I became a teacher by accident. Initially, I wanted to become a Catholic priest, but it didn't work. Then I decided to be a teacher and be able to preach not only the good news, but also the knowledge. I remember that as a firstborn, when I was in primary school, I had to assist my siblings to complete their homework, and my parents were really happy about it. Then when I'm teaching, I have a strong emotion that I'm assisting my brothers and sisters to co-construct the knowledge with them. Of course, I respect my learners, and I love them as we are learning from each other. My teaching philosophy stems from Rwandan and somehow African Ubuntu philosophy. I am because you are. This might be translated in Western languaging as collaborative learning by constructing knowledge. Thank you.
So, I'm enchanted by the idea of Ubuntu, I am because you are, as a point of departure. It was interesting to watch him work because he started as a priest, but he was also a choir director, and he brought this to class, and his concept of Ubuntu. And he wrote this song. It's almost like a jazz jam, but it's a song. And it starts with, some people can be over here, and some people can be, oh, my friend, oh, my friend. It goes like this. Oh, my friend, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I'm going to cut, I'm going to cut, I'm going to cut, I'm going to cut, using my scissors. Simple. It was quite elegant. And so he then went on to another one. I said, okay, we all use scissors. That's kind of cool. But then he had another one. He went, ooh, my friend. No, he said, ooh, mosquito, what do you do? What do you do? You give us malaria, you give us malaria, you give us malaria, you give us malaria. Go away, go away. Right. And so we see the connections. It's very simple. We can do this. But I don't have too many malaria lessons in Miami. Except my own, right? So what are we doing to inhibit the crescendo? We're trying to not inhibit the crescendo by resisting the transmission model. And we were very successful with Amin's work and Beth's work here in trying to figure this out. We see kids looking through the window. They're supposed to be outside playing football. No, they're watching us do a lesson, a reading lesson. They're so interested in what's going on, they're peering through the windows. The teacher's shooing them away. We're like, no, don't shoo them away. They want to be in the classroom. This is what you want. He's like, oh, that's right. Okay, yeah, that's what we want. Amin's like, come on, you want to come from the football field? Come on in. The more the merrier. Bring them on. And here we go. Cooperative learning. I don't think I got a better picture of it. And you can also see the paper that you see here on the yellow paper. This is paper from cement sacks that the teachers made in order to create the materials. So the materials are there on the side of the wall. And they had to do this, but they had an agreement with the construction people across the way. They said, hey, construction people, you need a place to store your cement sacks during the rainy season? Put them in our school. The only thing is, we get to use the paper when you're done. And so they had their materials. We went on a walk. We went on a walk to find, because in the curriculum we had a lesson on physics in the fulcrum. Pretty sophisticated curriculum item, but we didn't have stuff. We went on a walk. Guess what? We found stuff. It didn't take long. It was quite remarkable. In Afghanistan, this is my friend Hilda LeMay, who found yogurt pots and did math lessons using yogurt pots. And I want to bring up Afghanistan because Afghanistan is where we went with Mary Lou in 2014. And war was going on. It's still a difficult place, right? It's hard to escape the difficulties of Afghanistan and what happens there. There's walls and wire. Lots of walls and lots of wire. Well, one of the stories is Fahim. Fahim was not a rich guy, but he also found that he liked education, and he saw English as a means to make it. So when he was a little kid, in order to get around, he collected dung and sold it as fire fodder. And so that's how he managed to learn English, and he had to do it in secret. Well, these sort of stories start to resonate. I don't got a story like that, right? And the story in Afghanistan, and we have some guests here from there, multi-level classes, large classes, and lack of student interest. In other words, lecture style, transmission model. And we see it again. Anti-contextualization seems to exist in Afghanistan. Multi-level classes, no plans for the Ministry of Education to conduct proficiency testing. Pashtun can't win out, leaving English as a neutral language. Large classes, 150 students. Textbooks exist, but they're old and written in English. They're not written for Afghanistan, although that's changing a bit now. I'm happy to say we've got more books written in Afghanistan by Afghans about these materials. And then the concern about English as shibboleth. Things are a little bit better than they were in 2000, but the Taliban threatens anyone with ties to foreigners, thus causing deep concern for any English speaker. So a lot of people take risks in order to do this, right? So what are our lessons? And I just mentioned Hilda LeMay, the woman in the middle from Belgium, who I worked with in Rwanda, and she lived in Afghanistan for a long time, and she worked in the DRC for quite some time. And she has these ideas. She says, expats tend to cause more problems than solutions. Context is most important. Textbooks are of no use if a tomato can is the local measuring cup. Expats often think they're 1 meter above people. Absolutely the wrong approach. I can hear her now. They cannot understand interfamily connections in a new region. She says, the best projects, those that are sustainable, are those where instructors and students figure out how to pay themselves, not relying on outside sources, especially foreign donors. And women need to realize the confidence they have within themselves. Multivariate classes are a means for students to get left out. And we heard this. I heard this in Afghanistan from people I love. Teach to the center. Teach to the top. But you always leave somebody out. Somebody loses when you do that. Transmission models classes abound. But I'm learning from one of the colleagues that when he does cooperative learning, even with a class of 150, everybody can be included, even a class that big. Colonialist manifestations lead to administrator symbolic violence, a la Bourdieu. And TESOL should have a position statement against such practices. There's hope. Positive teachers are always a part of our landscape. We love our colleagues. Cooperative learning works, and policy has changed in some places where it was more difficult before and not so difficult now. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Ghana have instituted some policies that absolutely have made a difference in the educational systems. Doesn't mean it's perfect. We've got a ways to go, but those policies have made a difference. There's another thing I'd like to posit, and that's the idea that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has a statement about access to materials in your home language and access to education in your home language. And I would like to suggest that that be extended across the United Nations and then also through TESOL. An advanced statement on linguistically accessible education as a human right, not only to indigenous people, but everybody. Such would likely would change the charges to people like Mary Lou and me when we go to these places and we're asked to teach lessons on Martin Luther King. I don't mind teaching Martin Luther King. I love Martin Luther King. But when I went to Pakistan last year, I was asked to teach a lesson on Martin Luther King. I'm like, that's fine, but I want to spend 45 minutes during that lesson talking about Iqbal Muhammad, because he's a very resonating figure and he has sort of the same ideals. They're kind of cool. I'd much rather connect interculturally and internationally through Iqbal Muhammad. Right? Such would suggest a deep and purposeful effort toward meaningful assessment that connects to all our students' daily lives. So finally, I just want to say, when we go to these places, we know that everybody has a war story. We know that people have died at this location. These people died while I was there. Life goes on, though, somehow. When it's bad outside, and even when it's really bad, sometimes we still try to carry stuff. And we study because we're not going to wait. We're not going to wait at all because, like the mosaic says at Kabul Polytechnic University, education is light. We use transportation to get to work. And sometimes, even when it's bad outside, we let the kids play outside. And sometimes we dance. Why? Why do we dance? Because even among walls and wire, smoke and noise, despair and death, there are still oranges. Thanks.